Good day. My name is Kim Moody, and I'm your host for In the Mood with Kim G C Moody podcast. And I'm quite proud of myself. I'm recording a podcast here on December the 23rd, 2025, which is just a few days, or about a week, I guess, since the last time I recorded a podcast. So trying to get a little more regular here. And so what I thought I'd do with this podcast is just do a quick tax year in review. I wrote a Financial Post piece on this subject that got released today, December 23rd. So if you do want to read a kind of tongue-in-cheek piece on that, have a look at my Financial Post piece. I use Santa, with providing some gifts and some lumps of coal and also some tax wishes. So in any event, have a look at that. But first off, Merry Christmas to all my listeners and followers and friends and family. It's been a hell of a year, both on the professional and personal front and tax policy front. But now let's get going on the tax policy front. So the lots going on, but I'm going to start at the beginning of the year where we had the resignation of PM Trudeau, which really, because he prorogued Parliament at the same time, really threw a lot of the tax stuff that was waiting for passing into basically had to start again, because it's all dead on arrival when Parliament is prorogued. And so the big thing that was up in the air was, because Parliament had been prorogued, was the capital gains proposals, which came out of the April 16, 2024 budget, which, as a reminder, would have increased the inclusion rate for most taxpayers to 2/3, unless you're an individual, not a trust, but an individual who had less than $250,000 of capital gains. So just very, very poor policy. It was intended to apply June the 25th of 2024, so 10 weeks after announcement. So it just very, very silly stuff where people were racing to accelerate capital gains. And then we had all the political uncertainty about whether or not this stuff would even pass. And sure enough, on January the 6th, with the prorogation of Parliament, that was kind of the nail in the coffin. But we had a couple more steps to go there. And the first one was on January 31st of 2025, when the Department of Finance announced that they were going to, in quotes, defer the capital gains proposals to January 1st of 2026. And at that point, it was like, oh, here we got another nail in the coffin. No way that this thing is going to pass with all the political uncertainty, especially with the upcoming election that had to be called no later than October of 2025. And so then with the, as I call it, the Liberal coronation of Mark Carney as Liberal leader, during the leadership campaign in March of 2025, he announced that if he became Prime Minister, he wouldn't move forward with the capital gains proposals. And in a bit of twist of irony, Chrystia Freeland, the Liberal leadership candidate as well, announced that she wasn't going to move forward on the capital gains proposals if she got elected and became Prime Minister. And she's the one that proposed them back in April of 24 and vigorously defended it. And so I found that to be rather disingenuous and actually, frankly, distasteful in the whole scheme of things. Fast forward to the election, spring election of late April of 2025. And of course, the Liberals were re-elected in a minority position. And shortly thereafter, about a week after, the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, announced in a very unusual way that the capital gains proposals were indeed not moving forward. But he announced it on his Prime Minister's website, not through an official release in the Department of Finance. So again, very strange. In my view, that's not the way to announce changes to tax legislation or tax proposals, or frankly, tax policy in general. And then we had a short spring parliamentary session starting in mid-May and then going to the end of June, towards the end of June. And the only thing that was really of interest tax-wise during that parliamentary session was the introduction of a reduction of personal tax by 1% on the lowest personal tax bracket. Now, that was promised it was a copycat promise by the Liberals, because the Conservatives had promised a 2.5-point reduction at the lowest bracket. But in typical fashion, the Liberals, smartly, I guess, pretty much swiped a lot of the tax policy and election policy of the Conservatives. But in this case, it was a 1% promise, and so they've implemented that. Now that, as the Parliamentary Budget Officer, has noted, and others have noted numerous times, that 1% reduction is worth roughly $100 to the average Canadian. Not material, but it's being trumpeted as if it is, God's gift to taxation. And in some cases, some people have suggested that it's significant tax reform. I mean, that's just foolhardy. This is retail politics at its worst. And in my view, instead of doing a immaterial tax rate reduction, there should have been something more fulsome. Like, for example, the Conservatives during the election and even prior had promised a tax reform task force, and they carried that through during the election campaign. And in typical copycat fashion, the Liberals said that they would conduct a so-called expert review of the corporate tax system, which is really silly in the whole scheme of things, because it's not just the corporate tax system that needs to be reviewed. It's the entire tax system. And just to close off on that note, during the recent federal budget, no such mention was made of moving forward with a corporate tax review or even tax reform in general, because really, realistically, the Liberals have no interest in tax reform, which is really disappointing, because for any of you who follow my writings and other content, I'm pretty passionate about the fact that Canada needs tax reform, or like Jack Mintz, the renowned economist, says, Big Bang tax reform, to really help simplify the complexity and give a jolt to our economy, which we certainly needed. So that was that. And then fast forward to the end of June, actually 2 days before, on a Sunday night, again, we had a press release that the digital services tax, which was a 3% tax to be imposed on large tech companies who have Canadian subscribers, would be repealed. So think about that. On a Sunday night, 2 days before the digital services tax, which was effective law because it got passed in 2024, June of 24, but it was not scheduled to come into effect until July 1st of 2025. So it's law on the books, but 2 days before it's scheduled to be effective law, there's a press release saying that they're going to repeal it. Now, I understand the politics behind that. They're dealing with Donald Trump, etc. And I'm not a big fan of the digital services tax to begin with. I thought it was poor policy. But again, the criticism here is instead of dealing with this in the proper fashion and vigorously defending the digital services tax throughout the previous governments, we could have done the proper thing, and instead of a press release that came out 2 days before. So that was that. And then in the midst of summer, middle of summer in August, for tax geeks like me, we had a massive technical package released by the Department of Finance, things that were full of fixes and other goodies. And included in there was the trust reporting amendments. And for all those practitioners or affected taxpayers that were scrambling in 2024 to comply with the new trust reporting rules, including for bare trust, you'll know what I'm talking about. It was a very big debacle back then. And the Department of Finance responded to the criticism finally, and there's a whole story on that I could get into, but they responded about a year prior to that, in August of 24, with some proposed amendments for the trust reporting rules to try and provide some relief for certain bare trusts and certain trusts overall from the reporting regime. And then fast forward to August of 25, and we have some new proposals that responded to the August of 24 proposals. And all I'll say is that they're bloody complicated. They're really complicated proposals. And yes, they're intended to be relieving in nature, but it's so complicated that the average practitioner needs to literally, and I did this from, on my own personal website, I have a flow chart that tries to make sense of these proposals with 6 pages of footnotes, just to give you a description of how complicated these are. In my view, the bare trust rule should disappear. I can understand why the government wants trust reporting in order to keep up with other jurisdictions around the world that have similar rules. But bare trust, come on. That in my view, is just a data grab in the whole scheme of things and not really worthwhile. But what do I know? So fast forward to September 2nd of 2025, and we had this, Labor Day weekend, close to that weekend, announcement by Finance and Revenue Minister Champagne that he was asking the CRA to do a 100-day plan to improve its call center performance and other services. And for those of you who deal with the CRA on a regular basis, their service standards have really declined over the years, but their headcount has really increased. And some of their audits are just atrocious. And I've written a fair amount about this in the Financial Post. It's some of the worst I've ever seen. And it's too bad, because as much as, the CRA is the punching bag for a lot of people, including me in some cases, I'm not a big fan of beating them up because they have an important job to do. And it's a critical job for the country to make sure that our tax laws are administered correctly and that ultimately they collect the tax and on behalf of the government of Canada. And so, from that perspective, I'm not a big fan of beating them up. But when you see the bloat and the continued working from home, which I'm not a fan of at all, especially with such a complex job of administering tax, which needs, in my view, good training and good mentorship, which requires in-office performance, in my view, and supervision. That is no surprise that it's the service standards have gone down. But recently, around that time in September, people just literally couldn't get through. And it turns out that they had reduced some of their staffing at the call centers, which in hindsight I have no idea why they would have done that. I get that they need to reduce their overall headcount because it got bloated like you wouldn't believe because of budget increases. But to reduce such a critical function, that just makes no sense to me. And it tells me that the strategic direction of the CRA needs a complete rethink. And so, that's a topic for another day. But when I saw this 100-day plan, I was a little bit surprised, and I thought, wow, geez, we actually have a minister that recognizes that there's some problems here. Well, we'll see what happens. I don't like this whole so-called 100-day plan that's very political and comes out of a number of countries' playbooks, not the least of which is, the United States. And but having said that, I thought, okay, well, let's give this some time, see what happens. But as time went on, when you see the CRA, they created a 100-day website to track the so-called improvements that they were making. For example, in one that I recall was that in July or something like that of 25, they're only able to answer 35% of the calls, and their service standard was 70%. Well, I've since seen some people say that they'll never achieve 100%, which to me is not appropriate. If you tackle the root causes, there's no reason in my view that you can't get to 100%. And so to me, that's the ultimate objective. And are you going to get there in the short term? No. But can you get there in the long term? Absolutely, as long as it's a priority. And so I was refreshed by this so-called 100-day plan, thinking, let's see what they do. And the changes that were tracked on this website, I thought, okay, they're treating symptoms here. They're not tackling the root causes. So I was a little concerned. But then fast forward to the end of October, and we see that the Auditor General released a report on the CRA call centers. And it's like, okay, ding, ding. That's the reason why Minister Champagne asked for a 100-day plan is because it was pretty obvious that the minister and the CRA had been given an advance copy of the Auditor General's findings. And in order to limit the damage, they were going to do this so-called 100-day plan and try to sneak it by the goalie that, the average Canadian wouldn't notice this Auditor General damning report. And probably for the most part it worked, right? Because, if they hadn't done this so-called 100-day plan, all of a sudden the Auditor General report lands with some very damning stuff, it would look a lot worse had they not done this 100-day plan. And so very political, very poor strategy in the whole scheme of things, short-term thinking. And from that point forward, it was like, oh, great. I can almost guess what's going to happen on December the 11th, which is the 100th day of the 100-day plan. They'd come out with a lot of backslapping and say, hey, look at all the great work we did. And then fast forward to December 11th, that's exactly what they did. They came out on the morning. I was pretty excited. I wanted to see whether or not there's some great improvements, because I've been calling the CRA call centers throughout this 100-day plan to see if I noticed any improvements. Frankly, no, I did not notice any, I'll repeat myself, noticeable improvement on the call center. The loops that they put you through, the poor quality of the, it's computer-generated voice on the call center. It's just annoying, very annoying and very frustrating for the amount of time you're put on hold and the amount of loops that they put you through. Press one for this, press one. And all that is just a delay tactic. And so very, very frustrating. But I did that on December the 11th, couldn't get through again. And but the self-congratulatory press release was embarrassing. And I wrote about that in my Financial Post piece today. Because again, it talks about the symptoms, and yes, they're going to be doing some more work, but come on, let's see a plan. Because really, at the end of the day, that's what people like me want to see. We want to see a plan. We don't want to have to congratulate you for dealing with the symptoms of the disease. And the symptoms should have been dealt with a long time ago, but really, the disease itself should have been dealt with. And yes, I understand that you can't kill a disease very quickly. But at least if you come out with a protocol and a plan, that would be much, much better than self-congratulatory slaps on the back. So that was very, very disappointing overall to see that. And I've written about that, and I hope Canadians, remember this, because the CRA, which is by far the largest employer in the federal government, needs to be held to account on their poor service standards. It's not acceptable that you should be that you can't get through to their call centers. That's just not acceptable. So that's that. Fast forward to the federal budget of November the 4th. We originally they weren't going to put out a budget. They were going to do a fall economic statement that was announced about a week or so after the election in May. But ultimately they got roasted pretty hard for that. So quickly changed course and said, yeah, they're going to do a full budget in November. Oh, and then fast forward, they're going to change the budget cycle as well, so that the annual budget will now be in the fall as opposed to the spring, which I've written about that as well. I don't generally have a problem with having the budget released well in advance of the fiscal year end of the federal government, which the fiscal year end starts on April 1st annually and ends on March 31st. So to have it, well in advance is excellent. And for those historians, tax historians, you'll know that in 1985, the federal government did a whole research and put out recommendations in terms of how to improve the budget cycle. And one of the things they looked at was the timing of the budget. And they looked at whether it should be a spring budget or an early winter budget or a fall budget. So they looked at all that, and they concluded that, a late winter budget would be, sometime in mid-January or February would be best, and a fall budget would be too early, and ultimately nothing really happened with that, because to select the timing of the budget is very political. That is a trump card that the governing party or the government of the day holds in its fist very carefully. And so nothing really came out of those recommendations in 1985. And so, and understandably so, given the politics behind it. But now to move it to a fall budget where it's so far in advance, let's say it's November again. Well, that's November 4th again. So that's pretty much all November, December, January, February, March. 5 months in advance, you're going to present a full budget for the next fiscal year. That to me seems ridiculous. Although we have seen some people say, yay, yay. I like the 1985 government of the day, I think that's too far in advance. I do like a mid-January, maybe early February, because ultimately 5 months in advance, or even 4 months in advance, there's so much that can happen. And yes, you can cover it up and adjust with a spring update like they're planning to do, but the fulsome budget that's where all the meat and potatoes is of the next year's budget. In my view, that's too late. So what happened with this November budget? Massive spending, some of the biggest spending on record, which I have some significant problems with. I am a proud fiscal conservative, and to have this kind of massive spending and intrusion into our economy, I'm just not a big fan of. And I worry about our future generations and the amount of interest costs in our debt that is already accumulating at a massive rate. So that was kind of the highlight of the budget, was the massive spending, huge deficit. The next year's deficit is expected to be, off the top of my head, $76 billion, and not materially reducing over the next 4 years after that. And so that's not good. But we did have a couple of good pieces of news in the November 4th budget. From a tax perspective, the underused housing tax is repealed effective Jan 1 of 2025. So no filings for 2025. That's a good thing. In my view, when that was introduced in 2022, that was a ridiculous exercise and an intrusion into a market housing that the federal government had no business being in. And it was just a massive data grab. So good to see that go. We saw a repeal of the luxury tax for boats and airplanes, but for some crazy reason, not automobiles. Now, you explain that to me. I've had some economists try to explain it to me. Makes no sense to me. And in my view, especially with the struggles that our auto sector are going through, it would be ideal to see that go away. So those are two good pieces that came out of it. The rest was not really worthy of discussion, at least on this podcast. Fast forward to December the 16th, so just roughly a week ago now, not even roughly, it was exactly a week ago, and we had the CRA come out with an announcement that Bear Trusts for 2025 will not need to file. Now that's consistent with the draft legislation that came out in August of 25 that I already mentioned earlier on in this podcast, because it's in a bill now before Parliament, Bill C-15, but it's not yet passed, and Parliament has recessed, and so it'll have to be picked up in the next session in January. And so the CRA came out with this announcement in advance, and it was a good announcement in my view, that ultimately they're not going to expect filings for Bear Trust for 2025. So good news. And then last but not least, the CRA came out with an announcement just about 4 days ago, on December the 19th, with respect to new reporting requirements for the trucking industry. And there's been a fair amount written on this in terms of how some truckers are being paid, and whether or not the personal services business rules are being skirted because of that. And so now any payments made by trucking companies will have to issue a T4A slip. And I'd encourage you to go take a look at the CRA announcement on that. Just Google trucking industry CRA December 19th and you'll find it. But those affected will definitely need to read that and see what the changes are. So that was kind of a quick drive-by in terms of tax policy changes. What's the common theme here? Well, I think the common theme is that we have very politically motivated stuff going on with tax policy. And that's not The 1% reduction, that's just political nonsense. The repeal of the luxury tax for planes and boats, but not automobiles. Come on. I mean, there's no logical sense to that. It's nice to see the UHT disappear. Good stuff. But it's very haphazard and very political. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you're not going to get rid of politics and tax. It's like red wine and good food. They're inextricably linked. But at the end of the day, you could really try to diminish some of the brazen politics that we've seen in the tax system over the last number of years. And so that's kind of the theme for 2025 and certainly the previous years as well. What do I see for 2026 going forward? Unfortunately, I see a lot of the same. Now, maybe we'll have an election, maybe we'll have a government change, who knows, but doubtful that we'll see much policy change on the tax side. Instead, I think we'll see the headlines dominated by United States tensions again. The free trade agreement is up for renegotiation, so I'm sure we'll see a lot of that, with good tax policy being pushed down the policy agenda, which is too bad because in my view, like my good friend Jack Mintz, I think we need big bang tax reform to really make our tax system less complex, more approachable, and more competitive with the guerrilla south of the border and other jurisdictions around the world. So that's it. That's kind of the year in review and my quick crystal ball for 2026. Again, I want to wish all of you a Merry Christmas and hope that you have a great 2026. Thanks for your support. I look forward to engaging next year as well. Bye now.